Right, good evening. Good evening, good evening, good evening. This is the 10th and final session. The 10th and final session of the Free University Brighton course on Plato and Deleuze. Just altering a couple of little bits here. So this is the final kind of lecture session. And then what I'm going to do today is actually just I'm going to have a fairly relaxed conversation, hopefully, or talk about some ideas in a fairly relaxed way. I've had a very, very busy day, so I'm a little bit, you know what it's like. I mean, usually I spend Mondays, I spend Mondays with my notes for the lecture and reading some stuff and thinking through things and sort of having a bit of quiet time. But today's been the exact opposite, which is unfortunate. But life is life, and busy is busy. So I'm going to have I'm going to try and talk through a couple of ideas. I'm going to try and sort of think through a couple of ideas, or at least put a couple of ideas kind of together. For the seminar, for the Free University of Brighton people, we'll be meeting at 8 o'clock. And just to make clear for people from the Free University of Brighton, and for anyone else who wants to get involved, for the next 2 months there won't be any more lectures, but we will be using the forum to talk through and write about the text that we've been looking at, and that will be the process of assessment that goes on, as it were, or in a sense the process of continued study. So now we've had a kind of conversation about this stuff. Now we've had some ideas put into the mix for you to work with. If you want to pursue the next stage of this, or deepen your understanding, this is when you need to engage with the text a bit more directly. And so for the Free University of Brighton people, up until the end of February, the chat on the Plato and Deleuze forum will be open. I will be responding regularly, and we'll be talking through the various texts we've been looking at, the Phaedrus, the Sophist, and some of the texts from Deleuze. And I have put up today a series of starter questions, talking points, if you like, for you to kind of begin to think through that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of housekeeping done. So what I want to talk to you today about is the difference between an image and appearance, and why this might make why this might be important, why this might make some sense, why this might be, as it were, a way of trying to think Plato positively, try and think what's good and what's interesting and what's useful in his account, and at the same time take account of the critique that Deleuze has made in terms of the simulacrum and in terms of the system of cruelty versus the system of judgment. And in particular to focus a little bit on this problem that Deleuze calls transcendence, which he attributes to Plato, and which he thinks Plato is kind of introduces into philosophy. So let's try and be positive about Plato and about what he's doing, because one of the things that's clear is that the attempt by Socrates and Plato to engage their community, engage the ideas that are around them, is directed very explicitly towards truth, towards an attempt to distinguish truth from a whole series of appearances of truth, to distinguish when when we are presented with something that appears truthful but isn't, and this in a sense is almost the definition of sophistry, to present something that's false as though it were true. This is a kind of sophistic situation, a sophistic presentation, and so Plato and Socrates are trying to think truth for and with their community. And they're trying to think truth primarily as a kind of fixed point. I mean, and I think this is one of the difficulties. Let's just go back a little bit. So in the Sophist, what we've got is a text that follows a text we haven't looked at, which is a Theaetetus, and these two kind of go together. In fact, the Theaetetus is the text immediately preceding the Sophist in terms of its setting. And so when we open the Sophist and we're reading the first opening pages when the visitor turns up at Socrates' door, this immediately follows, from the Theaetetus, and at the end of the Theaetetus, there's a sort of scene in which they're going to see Socrates tomorrow. So these two texts are kind of put together quite closely. And in the Theaetetus, one of the issues that's kicking around quite strongly there is what, in contemporary terms, we might call relativism. So a relativism of truth, the idea that truth is not, let's say, a fixed point, but truth is kind of a movable feast. Truth is a truth for an individual. And Plato and Socrates are trying, in a sense, to think truth beyond this relativism. And plainly there's a kind of element of that in the Sophist as well. They're trying to deal with this issue of truth in the face of the appearance of truth, in the face of people who present arguments that appear to be true, but in fact aren't. And there's obviously a similar sort of kind of dynamic, in a sense, going on inside the Phaedrus, where where Socrates' dislike for Lysias' speech, and his dislike for his own first speech, is to do with the fact that they are game playing. They make sense, but they're not really focused on, or they're not really aiming at the truth. They're aiming at kind of making you seem intelligent, making the argument seem persuasive, but without any regard as to whether that persuasion gets us towards the truth. And so, for Plato and Socrates, this drive is to try and sort of think a truth that's fixed, a truth that isn't relative, a truth that is a truth for everybody for all time, etc. And this fixed point for truth involves more than a description. It involves more than just sensation. So it's not the kind of truths in which you might say, truly, I'm warm today, or something along those lines, which is a particular kind of relationship between me and my environment and the sensations. And whilst it's a kind of true statement, it's a trivial statement as well. It doesn't really have any import, and it's more a kind of a report of my situation than it is an account of the world, or. And so this fixed point for truth. This is what motivates the strategy of transcendence, because truth, this fixed point, is located outside of the everyday, outside of what we sometimes call the empirical, or the world of sensation, outside of the world of becoming and change, and it's located in this realm of the forms. It's located in this realm of the divine, that which goes beyond appearance, and so the primary dynamic in which the pursuit of truth is kind of organized in Plato and Socrates is through this appearance-reality distinction. And this appearance-reality distinction, it locates truth, the real, in this transcendent realm, and locates everything that we kind of encounter in the world around us, in the everyday world around us. It locates all of those as appearances that aren't in themselves true. And so we have to kind of be able to work through, go through, see through the appearance, see through that towards the truth. And the way we see through that is not with our eyes, it's with our intellect. And so reason gives access to the truth, but the way in which it does this is by pursuing a reality that's beyond the everyday and beyond the sensory, beyond the appearances. And so this fixed point of truth, which is transcendent, in other words, above and beyond the everyday. This is the kind of goal, and the appearance-reality distinction is the primary strategy by which we're going to kind of access this goal. Now, it's important that we maybe think about why do we want this kind of fixed point of truth? Why do we want this idea of a true account that's capable of being fixed? Now, I think here it's worth making a kind of analogy. So for Plato, the access to truth is through reason. But the strategy is aiming at this kind of fixed truth. In other words, a truth that's not dependent upon or relative to me or to a specific person or to somebody else, but it's a true in itself statement. It's something we might almost want to say is not in any sense dependent upon us. Even though we access it through reason, it's not in any sense dependent upon us. So it's a kind of feature of the world out there. And it's interesting in a sense to draw a parallel to the way in which that kind of dynamic operates in our contemporary world. And it's been interesting to see the conversations in the seminars which have regularly returned to the question of science and the question of something like mathematics and the question of a kind of way of thinking that we take to be capable of accessing reality. Beyond opinion, beyond subjective and relative experiences of that reality. And so one of the kind of curious things is in our modern world, the approach we often have towards science, which is a very problematic term, but the approach we often have towards science is that it is, in a sense, capable of accessing this eternally fixed, absolute, real world, not dependent upon us, not relative to us, and which we learn from, in a sense. The world is there. It's maybe difficult to see, but by the use of reason, this is science as well as Plato, if you like, by the use of these reasons, we can access this world. And so there's a kind of strange parallel. In a sense, Plato, despite the fact that he's plainly not a scientist in any kind of contemporary sense, the strategic kind of orientation towards the truth that underlies and underpins Plato's project is very, very similar to the strategic orientation that we are told underlies the scientific project. And so I think it's important to try and sort of think about the relationship that Plato, offers us to the truth. In particular, this relationship through appearance-reality distinction. It's important to try and think about that relationship that Plato offers us to the truth, not as something that's just an archaic relationship of some kind of abstract rationalist philosopher. This is also, I would argue, very much the kind of dynamic behind a very common presentation of the way we're meant to deal with science. Science tells us the truth. Science offers us facts. And the kind of anti-science debate that goes on, perhaps more in America than in Europe, but the anti-science debate that goes on is around this kind of relationship to securing a fixed point of truth, something that we can take as a secure foundation for our knowledge. Now, this strategy, and I think this strategy sort of, in a sense, is there's an analogy going on inside science as well, but this strategy uses this distinction between appearance and reality to try and somehow indicate to us and show that we shouldn't just take things as they seem to be. And what we have to ask, in a sense, is what does that particular strategy of appearance reality distinction, what does this present, what does this do to us? What does this make us think? How does this push us in certain sort of directions? Is it a useful concept, the appearance reality distinction? That's a kind of concept. Is it a useful concept for us to be able to access something like something like a truth beyond relativism, something like a truth for all of us, something like a truth that's in the world rather than in our heads? So let's just take a little step back and think, well, what is it that thought does? What is thought capable of? And on one account, a fairly common account that we might find in various different places, Thinking adds a moment of critical reflection. And that moment of critical reflection takes what we think we know and kind of suspends it and goes, well, I may not know this. I'm going to try and reflect upon how I feel, how I see, how I experience, how I think the world is. And I'm going to try and use reason to reflect upon those experiences of the world. And in doing that, just while I'm engaged in that critical moment, I'm kind of suspending what it is I think the world is. I'm trying to, question it. I'm trying to allow thought to, as it were, get it in between me and the world, in between the way in which I'm encountering the world, and I wouldn't say purify, but kind of check or test the way I think I'm relating to the world. And so I'm seeing an object on the horizon, and I want to kind of have this capacity to allow thought to try and track whether I might be being fooled. I might be having some illusion going on, and so I can kind of try and work out whether I'm actually able to trust the appearance. And there's a way of thinking about that by going to something like, a phrase, I thought I knew the way things were. So part of the motivation behind this kind of dynamic towards a fixed point of truth is a motivation of failure. A motivation that in certain situations things weren't as they appeared to be. And how am I going to get to a position in which I can kind of not implicitly or unquestioningly trust the appearance? How can I kind of test whether the appearance is an accurate or an honest appearance of reality, or whether it's a deceitful or illusory appearance of reality? And so one of the things that occurs when we have this appearance reality distinction is we have the possibility of the appearance being a false appearance. And so the truth and falsity of the appearance is kind of given to us alongside that appearance reality distinction, because there's not only one way in which the appearance can be connected to reality. It can reflect reality accurately, or it can be connected to reality in such a way as it gives direct and accurate access, or it can distort access to reality. And so we have this kind of sense in which the thought or thinking is going to kind of go in between appearance and reality and check to see which of those two things is taking place, whether the appearance is distorting reality or whether the appearance is giving us an accurate kind of entrance or access to reality. But this kind of failure that we encounter sometimes, and that kind of prompts us to think about how to learn a better strategy for dealing with reality. This kind of failures that occur, there are two different kinds of failures that can occur. Last week I talked, for example, about the failures that are presented by deception. And that one of the kind of core dynamics inside the sophist is to be able to reveal a kind of deception that's taking place in the sophistic statement, in the sophist practice. And it's very similar to the kind of deception that's taking place inside the Phaedrus. And so that's one of the ways in which we can kind of, as it were, we learn that we were lied to, we learn that we were deceived, and so we want to try and work out how, and thought is a kind of tool for this, working out how we can kind of check to see whether we're being deceived. But that deception depends upon this capacity for appearance to be a way of blocking access to reality as much as it can be a way of accessing reality sort of clearly and truthfully. But there's another way in which we encounter this kind of problem of the failure of appearance to give us direct access to reality, and that's when we might say when the appearance is liable to lead to mistakes. When something appears, when it's something, we might even say, there's no intention here, there's no person doing a deceiving, but there's a kind of way in which the reality of the world, nature itself, can kind of deceive us. The way things appear are not the way they actually are. And so there's two different two different kind of failure situations that prompt us to learn. One where we know we're being deceived by human beings, and this, as I mentioned last week, might be something that becomes more prominent with regard to living in cities and living in a kind of particular kind of civilizational structure. And this other one in which nature, as it were, deceives, and we're kind of deceived by nature. And when I say nature's deceived, let's think about just simply things. I mean, presumably we can all kind of understand what that means, but if not, think about the example of the way in which the sun looks. So to us, the appearance of the sun is one in which we appear to be fixed and the sun appears to be moving. And what we find, of course, is that through a series of other observations and the use of reason, we come to realize that actually that appearance is deceptive. That appearance is not the way things actually are. We're the ones moving, as is the sun, but we're the ones moving around the sun rather than the sun moving around the earth. But that appearance, it's quite reasonable in a sense to be deceived. It's not like somehow someone's tricked us. There's no deception going on, but the appearance itself, it kind of blocks access to the way things actually are. It kind of pushes us sideways, and we make a mistake. And when we make those kind of mistakes, when we encounter those kind of failures of access to the real through the appearance, these are the kind of prompts to learn. And so one of the things that's important to kind of disentangle is both of those situations are being dealt with by Socrates and Plato. Both the kind of way in which nature can deceive us and the way in which another human being can deceive us. One of which the human being, it can be intentional, and one of which nature is not intentional, but we need to find some other strategy other than just the appearance itself. We need to add something to that in order to be able to check whether we're being deceived. Now, this way of understanding these problems by using a distinction, an appearance-reality distinction, brings with it a whole kind of series of thoughts about what reality is. It kind of brings with it the very split that appears to be there between appearance and reality. And it brings with us, in particular, this sense in which appearance is not real. I mean, that's a really deep problem that comes with this, is that the appearance kind of begins to become a kind of ghostly face of reality, and a mask of reality, and we're constantly kind of feeling like somehow there's something beyond, there's something more to the world, more to the real, because the appearances can't possibly be all there is. And we're prompted, no matter what we want to do, even if we wanted to kind of reject Plato's transcendence and Plato's forms, we're still prompted to kind of encounter the world as an appearance behind which there's something truthful, there's something real. And in a sense, we are kind of then condemned to be fools if we take appearances as the world itself. And so we're kind of, and it's difficult, we know that there are these moments in which we have failed to encounter the world, in which somehow we've been deceived or we've made a mistake, in which somehow we need to add something other than just the way things seem to us and the way we see things. We need to add something to that in order to check and give some sort of better account of the world. And these are, almost unavoidable feelings when we come to the idea of learning about the world, because we know that there are situations, this is what prompts learning most often, we know that there are situations in which we have inadvertently mistaken what we take to be the appearance for the reality. And so this appearance-reality distinction is intuitively very, very powerful. It works very strongly to kind of give us a kind of a whole picture of the way in which the world and our relationship to the world operates. And so we feel in some sense that it's very easy to believe something that's that science fiction, like The Matrix, we find it's almost very easy to believe that this is the way things are. In contemporary kind of like speculative philosophy and speculative kind of thought, there's this moment in which people are going on and on about the fact that we might be living in a simulation, and there's various evidences that might be sort of cited for this. But part of what's behind that is the ease with which we don't believe the world is the way it is, in which we are able to kind of think there must be some reality behind this appearance. There must be something more than the way things seem to be, and that intuitive like power of that appearance reality distinction in part I think comes from the presence of the Platonic kind of philosophy in the background to Western thought, but also motivates some of what's there in Plato anyway. So it's not just simply I wouldn't say it was simply invented by Plato. Plato has articulated a kind of problem we have with the world, which is what is it that's going on when we have these failures, when we have these mistakes, when we have this encounter with the world in which the world isn't the way it seems to be. Now what I want to sort of suggest, and I think this is what Deleuze is suggesting, is that this appearance reality distinction points us towards taking a particular path. And that particular path involves the idea that reality is beyond the world of appearance, beyond the world of everyday life, and that the world of everyday life is, in a sense, just a veil between us and this world, and that this dynamic towards transcendence is kind of inbuilt into the appearance reality distinction. And so one of the things I think that he's trying to do when he brings forward the ideas of the simulacrum is to try and articulate, in a sense, a different kind of concept that can cope with those failures in our relationship to the world that prompt us to learn and prompt us to think, oh, it wasn't quite, I thought I knew the way things were, but they're not actually like that, or I thought I knew, this is how it seemed to me, or this is what I saw, but that's obviously not what was going on, the sun and the earth relation, for example. And so he's trying to articulate a different kind of concept that would enable us to deal with those problems, those actual real problems, without getting trapped into a concept like appearance reality that pushes us to posit the idea that the real world is transcendent to this world we live in. And part of the reason for Deleuze doing that is that he would argue that appearance reality distinction, in a sense, negates the world we live in. It says that this isn't the real world. And obviously we've got a whole bunch of kind of theological overtones there, because that kind of dynamic is obviously there inside Christianity and a lot of Judeo-Christian religions, and it's kind of there in a lot of the monotheistic religions, in which this kind of the real world is that which comes after judgment, or that which is beyond this kind of veil of tears we live in, and so Deleuze's kind of strategy is to sort of see whether we can articulate a different kind of concept from appearance reality that will prevent us from negating the world by going towards a kind of transcendent reality. And I think one of the ways in which we can begin to think on a slightly different tack from the appearance reality distinction is to use the concept of the image, and to think about the difference between an image and an appearance, and the way in which images and appearances, whilst often taken to be kind of synonyms, actually in a conceptual level operate very differently and push us towards different kinds of conclusions, push us towards different kind of relationships to the world. And so that this image appearance distinction and the different ways in which those concepts operate offer us different strategies for coping with the world and coping with the way in which we learn about the world and deal with the problems that the world presents us when things aren't quite as they seem to be. Okay, so I'm going to take a little 5-minute break there. So go and stretch your legs or go and do what you need to do. I'll be back at 7:35, and I will chat a little bit more about this image issue and what we can do with the image.
In Panorama in
Okay, so I'll return. I just want to begin with, I just want to read a little piece, and this is right towards the end of Deleuze's text, Plato and the Simulacrum. I'll bring this up for you. And this is page 278 of the Logic of Sense, the Athlone edition, and I'm just going to read this particular passage here, beginning with this point. To the question, what is the use of philosophy? The answer must be, what other object would have an interest in holding forth the image of a free man, and in denouncing all of the forces which need myth and troubled spirit in order to establish their power? Nature is not opposed to custom, for there are natural customs. Nature is not opposed to convention. That the law depends upon conventions does not exclude the existence of natural law, that is, a natural function of law which measures the illegitimacy of desires against the disturbance of spirit which accompanies them. Nature is not opposed to invention, inventions being discoveries of nature itself. But nature is opposed to myth. Describing the history of humanity, Lucretius offers us a sort of law of compensation. Man's unhappiness comes not from his customs, conventions, inventions, or industry, but from the side of myth which is mixed with them, and from the false infinite which it introduces into his feelings and his works. To the origins of language, the discovery of fire, and the first metals, royalty, wealth, and property are added, which are mythical in their principle. To the conventions of law and justice, the belief in gods. To the use of bronze and iron, the development of war. To the inventions of art and industry, luxury, and frenzy. The events which bring about the unhappiness of humanity are inseparable from the myths which render them possible. To distinguish in men what amounts to myth and what amounts to nature, and in nature itself to distinguish what is truly infinite from what is not, such is the practical and speculative object of naturalism. Now, this particular passage locates myth as it were, kind of central problematic here. And myth is in a sense what I'm talking about in terms of image. And so that's one of the kind of prime forms of image. And this kind of, in a sense, explains perhaps why, or gives us an indication perhaps as to why myth plays such a kind of prominent and strange role in so many of Plato's texts. It's very noticeable that it plays this kind of key role inside the Phaedrus. There's the whole myth of the charioteer and the chariot race into the heavens. But myths play a continuous role all the way throughout Plato, and they have this kind of crucial moment often in the dialogue in which they, the argument reaches a certain point at which then a myth has to be presented in order to give us, or to give the people inside the dialogue, an image of what's being argued about, an image of reality. And it's this that I think can begin to give us a distinction between image and appearance. Appearance presents, as it were, appearance presents a transcendent realm of reality, somehow beyond the appearance, whereas image organizes the reality into a particular form. And that doesn't mean that there's necessarily... So an image isn't an appearance in that sense. It doesn't have built into it this kind of moment beyond, this moment of reality beyond the appearance. The image gives us a way in which the world is encountered. It kind of gives us something like a frame, a framing of the world. And so what I want to suggest is that this relationship between image... and its kind of way of us, the way in which it can organise our encounter with the world. It's a bad organisation can lead to error, can lead to mistake. A bad organisation can account for those failures that the world sometimes offers us in a better way than the appearance-reality distinction. because it doesn't push us towards this transcendent moment in which the world we live in is somehow false and reality is somehow something beyond that we can only access with our intellect. It doesn't say that the intellect and reason aren't useful. It does not say that we're not going to encounter failures in our relationship to the world, or that we need to learn, as it were, how to deal with the way in which those failures are kind of bound up with the way we see the world. What it says is that, in a sense, the world and the encounter of the world is always organised in a particular way. It's never neutral. Okay, it's never neutral. And I think this gives us a slightly different kind of tack and a slightly different concept with which we can begin to deal with problems like, the appearance of the sun, when it seems to be going around the earth. Problems of the way in which certain things that we encounter in the world, seem to be one way, and yet we kind of find out later that they're a different way. And so, if the way the world seems to be, we make a mistake and we use the appearance-reality distinction, then somehow we're posing the world as somehow beyond us. If instead when we make a mistake, we've made a mistake in a sense because the image we have, the image that we're involved with in our encounter with the world is disorganizing the world, then it's the image that can be altered and readjusted. And at no point do we need to kind of say something like, and the real world beyond that is something that we can access through reason. What we're saying in a sense is something like, or much more like, my glasses are distorting. There's a kind of process by which, in the way in which I see the world, in the way in which I encounter the world, the way it's organised has produced a distortion. And reason in that situation can try and be a tool by which we work out where those distortions are. Not where the false appearance is, but rather where the image that we have and that we're working with, and that we're probably kind of built into us, the way in which that image might need to be readjusted. Now, images can do two things, therefore. That appearances don't really have the same capacity to do. Images can capture us and they can liberate us. A bad image can hold us captive, and a good image can enable us to see to get a new vision of the world. And in no situation are we saying the world, as it were, exists beyond the image. The world is precisely our relationship to the things around us, but in a particular way, organised in a particular way. And so what we would do when we encounter mistakes or illusions or failures of the world is to think about the way in which we might want to reorganise our image of it. And this also is a kind of, a way in which we might think about, for example, what happens when we are deceived. Because obviously in the process of being deceived, if the deceit is successful, we don't notice. But what actually happens is if we encounter later on evidence that we were deceived, it's not so much what was said that is then changed, it's the person behind that. We don't think, I was deceived. We think, there was someone who deceived me. I learned something about the person who gave me that particular presentation. And similarly, if it's the world that's made the mistake, we don't necessarily have to think somehow the world lied to me, but I can rearrange and reorganise the way in which I'm kind of connected into the world. Now, I think on that basis that we can begin to get a little bit of a grip with how Deleuze's kind of critique, how his reversal of Platonism, what he calls the reversal of Platonism, takes place. Because instead of going, as it were, towards this transcendent world, instead of having that particular dynamic towards the fixed point that's somehow out there, the reversal of Platonism pulls back on us and sort of argues something like, well, there is an effect of the image that we have of the world, but its effect is kind of somehow a feedback effect with us. It comes back to the way in which we have been organised in our perceptions of the world. And that image, that idea of an image, if we take that as a kind of role of the myth, then in a sense different myths will give us different kinds of situations, different kind of worlds. We will be organised, and our world will be organised dependent upon the particular kind of myths or images that we have in which we see the world, in which the world is kind of given to us. So the world is never given to us as it were in itself. It's never given to us as a sort of simple fact. It's always given to us as a kind of organised fact in a particular kind of way. Certain things are selected, certain things are emphasised, certain characters are important, certain things are de-emphasised, ignored, certain characters don't exist. And I think there's a kind of good case to be made that this is a really important concept for Deleuze. In his work, The Difference in Repetition, which is written about the same time as The Logic of Sense, from which this text here, the Simulacrum, an ancient philosophy, comes. In his work, Difference in Repetition, it's a 5-chapter book, well, it's a 6-chapter book. There's 5 main chapters, but the central chapter, the kind of bridge of the book, is this chapter called The Image of Thought, in which he argues that, in a sense, coming from Plato, we've kind of considered and taken thought to be a particular kind of thing. For example, that we've taken thought to be something that naturally looks for the truth, whereas in fact he says there's no reason to believe this, and it may well be the fact that thought kind of avoids the truth, in the same way that we don't, that we might say someone avoids a difficult truth about themselves, and that thought often, is taken to be, in the general image of thought, a kind of neutral, good, positive, lover of the truth, but in fact, this may not be the case. And so he talks about the idea of what he calls misosophy, a kind of hatred of wisdom or dislike of wisdom, a dislike of feeling like you understand the world, a dislike of like feeling like you know the truth, and one in which you want to be sort of more suspicious perhaps of that, because if you feel like you understand, if you feel like you know, if you feel like you're sure and you're certain, what's kind of being missed is what is kind of what is in you that makes you want to believe that the world is that particular way. Why that image, in a sense, benefits you. And we see this, for example, inside what we might think of as some of the political realms. When people are challenging the kind of images they have of flags or statues, the images they might have of certain kind of types of person in the world, we encounter the idea that somehow there's a kind of clash of ideologies. Well, in fact, there's much more likely to be, on Deleuze's term, a kind of clash of different images, and those images are organising the world. So in fact, the person who thinks that someone on the dole is a scrounger, is kind of they've not encountered that person in any sort of way. What they're encountering is a particular person as they are organised through the image that they have of the world. And what Deleuze wants to argue inside Difference and Repetition is that philosophy needs to kind of be a thinking without an image. It kind of needs to be able to separate out and take a critical perspective on the image it's using or the image it's involved with in its relationship to the world. Now, it's not just Deleuze that has this kind of relationship to an image. There's a lovely line inside Wittgenstein's philosophical investigation in which he talks about his earlier work, a book called The Tractatus. And Wittgenstein is famous for having these two very, very kind of important texts. The first one is the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and the second one is the Philosophical Investigations. And in the second text, in the Philosophical Investigations, he's very critical of this first book, the Tractatus. And at one point, he says that a picture held us captive. He says this in the Philosophical Investigations. A picture held us captive, and he's probably referring to Russell as well as himself in this situation. And this picture was of a particular relationship between words and world. And in the Philosophical Investigations, he tries to articulate a different relationship to language, one that's not the one that he articulates in the Tractatus. There, he articulates this idea that somehow there are kind of basic names that are kind of attached to some kind of objects in the world, and that then sentences and knowledge are made up of kind of these components, these basic names. But the way in which we have access to the world is because these basic names are attached to these kind of objects in the world. in the philosophical investigations, that picture he thinks is one that held us captive, and he tries to talk about the way in which he calls them language games. He tries to talk about the way in which the kind of forms and practices of our speech give a set of rules for how in a particular game we're going to encounter the world. And in fact, to deal with errors or deal with mistakes, we don't look at, as it were, somehow an appearance beyond the reality. We look at what particular kind of game we were playing when we made that mistake. And so this idea of an image, it was also interesting to note that when Wittgenstein is saying this inside the philosophical investigations, he's referring explicitly to the Theaetetus, Plato's Theaetetus. This is in section 46 of the philosophical investigations, if you're interested in looking it up. And he explicitly was referring to exactly the same kind of problematic that we're dealing with Plato, this appearance-reality distinction, and in particular this problem of trying to access a fixed point in the face of a kind of relativism. So the image can hold us captive. An image can kind of misorganize or disorganize our relationship to the world, and we will encounter that disorganization at the points at which, as it were, the image fails. There's a kind of conflict between the things we think should happen because of that image and the things that maybe actually do happen. And somehow the image kind of gives us this capacity. It's not just in a sense, an image isn't an image in the moment. An image kind of organizes the past and the future. An image organizes our relationship to the world, and an image organizes what we think is going to happen, what kind of events follow. And when those things don't follow, when when the world doesn't go the way we thought it would, then it's quite often something wrong with the image that made us think it would go that way in the first place. And so the image can hold us captive, and we can encounter that captivity when we make mistakes, and we can see that reason can be used as a kind of learning process. But an image can also liberate us, and that's what's interesting about the idea of the image, rather than this notion of appearance transcendent reality. The image can capture or it can liberate us. And one of the ways in which we can kind of encounter this kind of liberation, well, first of all, is through mythologies. Different mythologies can give us a kind of different relationship to the world, and they don't necessarily have to have a kind of because mythologies aren't true or false in a sense. Mythologies are kind of images of the world that organize us. A different mythology can sometimes give us a kind of different relationship to the world, and can sometimes give us a kind of liberational relationship, or liberate us from problems that we've encountered. So there's a sense in which a good myth can do you a lot of good, and a bad myth can do you a lot of harm. And I think there's a lot of kind of behind a lot of the conflict in religion. There's this conflict, I think, around this relationship to the image that the religion is presenting, and whether it can do you positive or negative, whether it can organize or disorganize you in a good or a bad way. But there's also a sense in which, because an image has this capacity to perhaps liberate as well as capture, what I would mean by that is an image can enable us to see the world completely anew. A good image can enable us to see the world completely anew, and quite often the way in which those images that can liberate us are encountered is through what we call theory. Okay. Now it's interesting to just track the kind of root of what theory means, and it's a Greek word, theorein, and in a sense it's a very strange word in a sense, because theorein basically means something, the contemplation of the divine. And as I said towards the start of the course, when we hear this notion of divinity, when we hear this notion of the divine, one of the things we might want to talk about or kind of connect to that sense of the divine is the infinite. More than just the finite moments of there, but this kind of this infinite sort of structure, infinite relationship to the world. And so the contemplation of the divine, we might want to kind of think about as the contemplation of the infinite, and that itself is this, instead of being a fixed point, truth being a fixed point, what we're talking about when we use the word infinite there is something that is not something that is the case infinitely, not finite, not if it is the case today and is something different tomorrow, but is the case, just is the case, full stop, infinite. And so theory as this kind of contemplation of the divine is one of the ways in which we try and produce different images. And in a sense experiment with images that reorganize that relationship to the world. And some things some things that we can some things that we can see in the world can only be seen within certain theories. And that might seem like they become relative in a sense to those particular theories. But what we might want to do instead is sort of say those objects exist inside of the world that is organized by that particular image, inside the world which is, understood within that particular framework. Now, these theoretical objects are actually, parts of a world organized through a particular kind of image. And so when, let's say, Newton begins to develop his account of the world, he develops this thing called calculus. And he uses this kind of dynamic relationship between different forces, which is what calculus kind of gives us an account of and gives us an ability to kind of quantify. He uses this to then generate his theories around unseen forces, theoretical objects like gravity. In doing so, he also generates certain other theoretical objects, in his case, things he calls fluxions, which are what we sometimes now translate as infinitesimals, these kind of tiny little objects that are there that need to be there for this differential, this calculus to operate for Newton. And he gets into a lot of trouble with that. There's a guy called Bishop Berkeley who argues with Newton at the time, a very strong argument that Newton's account depends upon these theoretical objects, fluxions, that themselves are sort of only a result of Newton's theory. So they're kind of a circular kind of problem. And Berkeley's argument is pretty strong philosophically, but as we know, Newton's argument mathematically and scientifically is far more capable of explaining the world than many other theories previous to that, and so takes it in a sense to be a competent image that's organized the world for us in a way in which we can sort of have more capacity. It increases our capacity. And so just because a theoretical object in a sense doesn't seem real. I mean, that's a kind of strange term to use, but just because a theoretical object is there doesn't mean it's a fictional object. There's a difference between a theoretical object and a fictional object. And similarly, we might say the same thing with someone like Marx. The idea of surplus value that Marx puts forward is something that only exists within a kind of image of the political economy that Marx develops, a particular kind of way of conceiving that's distinct from another image, which might be that political economy, or the way in which the economy operates, is a kind of natural fact based upon transactions in the market. And Marx is, and this is one of the difficulties when people are kind of trying to talk about the idea of whether these theories are true accounts of the world, because what they're doing when they do that is reverting back to an appearance reality distinction and saying, is this the proper account, is this the proper appearance of the world, rather than understanding that each of those images organizes the world in a particular way and from a particular perspective. And does certain things. It enables certain things and it restricts certain things. And in that sort of situation, you're not giving up truth. You're not giving up the idea that there is certain sort of mistakes that can be made, and that therefore there are errors that can be corrected, and therefore there's a kind of sense in which there's a truth about the world. You're not giving up that. You're just basically arguing, or you're essentially sort of saying, those truths that exist are always dependent upon the frame or the image within which they make sense. Within a different image of the world than Newton's, the idea of a fluxion makes no sense, as Berkeley suggested. Within a different world than Marx presents, the idea of surplus value makes no sense. But within those frameworks, it gives you certain ways of encountering, what we would call reality, the way things actually are, and it gives you certain ways of dealing with those. And in the end, the way of dealing with an image is to see, in a sense, what we can do with it and what it enables us to do. And so that distinction between image and appearance, I think, is one of the ways of us beginning to try and get into the Deleuzean critique and other people's critiques of Plato, to try and sort of put some distance between this overarching problem of appearance reality, and to not dismiss what Plato is doing, but to try and sort of work out where we think they may have gone wrong and where we might be able to develop a slightly more interesting concept. And I think Deleuze, as I say, suggests that this image of this concept of the image or the simulacrum is the way in which we might want to develop that, and there are other possibilities and other options that we might encounter. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you very much for everyone who has popped along and listened and spent time trying to think about this stuff during the course. And as I say, for those of you in the Free University of Brighton and anyone else who wants to get involved through the Discord, I'm going to be spending the next couple of months continuing to read these texts and commenting on with people who want to think through them in a bit more detail, using the practice of writing and commenting on the texts themselves. And I will be sort of involved in dialogue with that. So if you do want to get involved in that, you're more than welcome. Obviously, if you're involved in the Free University of Brighton, that's what's going on there. And okay, once again, thank you very much, everybody. I'll be back next term with an introduction to philosophy course, and in the summer term, I'm going to be running a course called the Freudian Spaceship, which looks at Frantz Fanon, schizoanalysis, and the relationship to climate and the Earth. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. See you soon. And for FUB people, I'll see you in 5 minutes in Zoom.